Did you want to?
Yeah. Okay, let's get started.
Councillor Hoy, you should go first.
Chris Hoy, Salem City Council, Council President.
Virginia Stapleton, City Councilor for Ward 1.
Shane Griggs, President, Salem Planning Commission.
Ashley Schweikart, Salem Planning Commission.
Ian Levin, Salem Planning Commission.
I'm Eunice Kim, Long Range Planning Manager, City of Salem. I think Austin, Lisa, and Norm are here if you want to introduce yourselves.
Hi, Lisa Anderson, I will be the Planning Administrator.
Norman Wright, the Community Development Director.
Austin Ross, Long Range Planner.
Oh, and Zach.
Zachary Cardoso. I'm an admin analyst for planning.
Great. I'm going to share my screen 1 second. So welcome to our 4th zoning subcommittee meeting as part of the Salem project. Thank you everyone for joining us. Can you all see my screen? Okay, great. So today we're going to, again, give a brief overview of what we're working on and then really revisit the last 3 zoning options. There are 10 people signed up today to talk during public comment. So I thought what we would do is kind of pause after each zoning option to see if people wanted to speak specifically to that option or if they wanted to wait till the end. Everyone will have 3 minutes to talk. So as you all know, we're working on the Salem project, a multi-year project to update our comprehensive plan. This is really the framework that will guide how we grow and develop over the next 20, 30 years. We're focused really in this committee on how we can help reduce our greenhouse gas emissions through code changes. The council set a goal back in 2020 to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to carbon neutral by 2050. And so this is an ambitious goal, and we're trying to figure out kind of the best ways in terms of the zoning code to help make that happen, to help move us towards those goals. We have adopted or incorporated the greenhouse gas emissions goal into our Salem vision, and we plan to carry that forward as a goal into the comprehensive plan. We also want to, again, look at specific code changes we could make to help move that forward. Just as a reminder, we have done a lot in terms of trying to add mixed use land along Chariot's core network. Those are our frequent transit routes that Chariot has committed to keeping service on and increasing service in the future. We've also added the idea of neighborhood hubs, which helps create complete neighborhoods where people can kind of walk to meet some of their daily needs. Kind of the question before this zoning subcommittee is, how do we do more, or do we want to do more to promote housing and mixed use near transit and near services? This is very much in line with the work the Climate Action Plan is doing. That plan is looking at over, I think, 200 different strategies. Some of them are very much related to the link between land use and transportation. And so one of their strategies, or 2 of their strategies, really are about promoting development, housing, mixed use development near transit and in walkable areas. I think Commissioner Pollock has joined us. So these are the 6 options that we have been discussing throughout our time on the zoning subcommittee. We're again going to focus on the last 4 options today and dive into further detail. So the 4th option, the first one we're going to talk about today, is requiring multifamily housing in our mixed use zones, particularly along the core network. The idea behind this option is to really see, are there areas where we want to ensure that housing is developed in those locations as opposed to commercial? And I'll show you, the map is next. So the last time we talked about this a couple weeks ago, the committee was really kind of leaning towards requiring housing in all of the mixed use zones within a quarter mile of the core network. Since then, we've been kind of doing some research to really understand what are some of the implications of doing this, what's the feasibility, and when should this requirement apply? Should it be when any development occurs along those mixed use zones near the core network? Is it infill projects or complete redevelopment? And so again, we looked at some projects that have been happening in that area to see kind of what development we've been seeing, and again, what the implications would be. So this is just a map that shows kind of the 3 mixed use zones. Mixed use 1 and 2 are current mixed use zones. Mixed use 3 is a new zone that we're proposing largely along the core network, which is the red line you see on this map. throughout the Salem project, we've really talked about mixed use as zones and areas where there's flexibility in the uses people can do on their property. So we've talked about, you could do housing, you could do retail, you could do restaurants, you could do office, or you could do a combination of all of the above. This is kind of changing the conversation a bit by saying potentially along the core network, housing would be required. So it would be less flexible than the way that we've talked about it, but it would really put an emphasis on housing. So we looked at some examples of different infill and redevelopment projects, again, that have happened near that core network, and wanted to just think about what it would mean if there was a requirement for housing, for example, that was triggered when someone did infill on their existing project. So this is just an example along Liberty Road, where there's an existing shopping plaza. You're probably familiar with it, has a Roths in it. And an infill project was done, built in 2011. So this is the kind of the large parking lot that is in that plaza. And the project was to add this subway. And so we wanted to kind of think about if the trigger for requiring housing in the mixed use zones was infill, would this subway had to have included housing essentially, or somewhere on this site when the subway was added.
And Eunice, don't we have something similar happening right now, like at the Willamette Town Center where they're...
Yeah, that's the next one.
Oh, awesome. Okay, cool.
Yeah, you're exactly. So the Old Lancaster Mall or Willamette Town Center, they've been doing a lot of infill kind of retail pads in their parking lots. And so this has kind of been taking places in phases. This is the red circle is an area that they've recently started building another retail. And so we went by it actually Friday, and this is a picture of the building that's under construction. So again, the question is, if info is going to be a trigger, would this have occurred? What would that have meant in terms of they would have needed to include housing in that development? Another one's on Lancaster Drive. Again, where there's existing businesses, they added a restaurant and a shell buildings, and this is what it looks like now. And these are for businesses, not for housing, that they recently did this infill project. And then switching over to complete redevelopment, this is where they've took down the buildings completely and redeveloped the entire site. One example is on Capitol Street, the old Arctic Circle that they demolished, and now it's an eye center. Again, if housing were a requirement, would this have occurred? Would this developer or property owner done this project? This is in West Salem, where there used to be an industrial building. It then became a parking lot and now is a physical therapy. So you can kind of see the evolution of that site. And the last example is on Commercial Street, where they did some redevelopment, and it now includes a Starbucks and other stores. So we really wanted to kind of think about would these projects occur, would have been feasible for these projects to incorporate housing if we're going to require housing along the core network in these mixed use zones or future mixed use zones. So another thing we did is we went back to an old project, the State Street Corridor project that we finished several years ago. And during that project, we actually looked at the feasibility. We worked with David Glennie and Jennifer Martin, who's I think here with us today, to look at the financial feasibility of doing mixed use. This is a project that we kind of scoped as having retail on the ground floor, 24 housing units on the upper 3 floors, and parking behind. And we wanted to see, would the market support a project like this where there is commercial uses, but again, the ideal would be to have some housing with it along State Street. And with the expertise of David and Jennifer, we learned that it would not be financially feasible. The gap at the time was millions of dollars. And I think I have talked to Jennifer recently, and given construction costs and everything, the gap would be bigger today. So kind of thinking about all of those kind of implications and the feasibility of what we've seen happen and what potentially could happen in the future, we wanted to think more about the incentives track versus the requirements track of housing. So far in this zoning subcommittee, the first 3 options really are the incentive side, the allowance side. So this subcommittee is kind of leaning towards increasing the heights in the mixed use 3 zone, increasing the minimum densities in the mixed use and the multifamily 2 zone, and eliminating parking requirements for mixed use buildings or mixed use projects along the core network. All of those are really to create the opportunity for more housing along the core network in areas where, again, there's transit services, but doesn't require it. And we kind of started talking a little bit about financial incentives last meeting. And this is a map that shows the MUTIP area where we have a 10-year property tax abatement program. And I know that program is being looked at both in terms of should the criteria for when you get this, be tightened or changed. And tonight, as part of the City Council work session, House Bill 2001 is going to require us to take a look again at other incentives for middle housing in particular. And one of the recommendations potentially is to increase this boundary to incorporate more areas outside of the downtown area. And so given kind of all of that, we are recommending that we actually wait until incentives are available to support the housing requirement and to lean more heavily on the incentive tracks for housing. I know that's not where the zoning committee landed last, 2 weeks ago, but we wanted to kind of reconsider that and have that discussion and kind of given some of the implications of requiring housing, again, all along the core network. I know there are some folks here from the public who maybe want to speak to this, but first I wanted to see if, the zoning subcommittee members, if you had questions or wanted or comments. Go ahead, Ian. Oh, Commissioner Levin, sorry.
That's quite all right. Ian or Commissioner Levin, I'm not that old yet. I think this is a really timely conversation and really fortuitous that we started off with this, because after our last hearing or subcommittee meeting, I had a lengthy conversation with one of my commercial real estate colleagues about the kind of the direction that we ended up going in the last meeting. And so we sparred over it for a solid hour. And I have to say that by the end, I was actually convinced that we were looking at almost some of the similar projects that you actually brought up, that the requirement piece along the core network was going to create development conflicts going forward that would prohibit any development from happening on a site. The subway was a picture perfect one. There's absolutely no reason that an out pad on a retail center like that should be required to have apartments above it. It doesn't fit where the looking at where we were with some of the multifamily stuff, I wanted to say that instead of requirements, doing more of the incentive track that might motivate corporate private partnership between a subway. And I want to kind of use the subway as the conversation point, because subway corporate would rather have a franchise looking little model that they have of what their outpad stores should look like. And so to tell them that there's going to have to be apartment units above that versus would potentially dissuade somebody like a subway coming into that community or that neighborhood. Where if there's incentives for the developer to put those there, they can use those in concert with incoming tenant, show them value of potentially selling them on the idea of live-in customers upstairs. There's all types of creative pitches that folks in the real estate industry will take on to sell a piece of real estate. So I would agree with kind of what Eunice has provided, that we really need to look again at kind of the direction we were going last meeting with the requirement along the core network, and at least until there are other development incentives in place that would somehow offset it. Otherwise, the method of just building incentives into our code, that if a developer provides multifamily units. Maybe if they're multifamily units and they're sub a certain percent of the average income level, that there's even more incentives, so that it constantly builds on top of itself to motivate developers to put in more or to expand on kind of what was an original cookie cutter plan for something like a subway.
Commissioner Schweikart.
Oh, I think Chain was before me. Oh, okay. All right. I'm going. I hear what Ian's saying, and I think that some of the examples that were provided, I think do allow us to see kind of the real world implications here. I guess I would go maybe a slightly different direction. And actually one of the pieces of public comment we got before this meeting kind of brought it up, which is that, you know, there should always be a way to allow the development community to utilize their piece of land in the way that they want it, while also balancing the needs and the priorities of what the city would like to include in the community at large. And so, you know, to me, maybe the idea is, if you're building on an infill piece and you want to build, you know, strictly a commercial project, have it in lieu fee. Just have the ability for that commercial developer to then pay into an affordable housing, pot for the city. So that way, if they're not going to be building the residential piece that is part of the zoning code, that's okay. They don't need to build that housing piece. They should just pay an in lieu fee. So that way the city is able to say, here, look, we are able to then continue our vision of providing more housing to a variety of income levels. And we are going to then be able to take that in lieu fee funding and give it to somebody who is going to be providing that housing to a variety of income levels. So I don't think that necessarily like that we would put something like this into place, like a zoning change into place that says you have to build residential on any infill in the core network, and have that be where it ends, period, end of story. I think it could be that that's a requirement, and if you don't want to do that, here's your payment that you pay for the housing piece you're not going to provide. And I think that that's a very reasonable kind of stick in the carrot stick trade-off there. I think a lot of other communities do it in other states, other big cities. So I think it's something that's worth looking at.
If I can follow up, would it be something that would be site specific, or is it more something like the construction excise tax that would apply more broadly, and then that money would funnel to affordable housing projects? Are you saying specific?
The latter.
Sites?
The latter.
Mm-hmm. So broader construction. Okay. And that is something that I think is on potentially could be reconsidered. It is something that related to House Bill 2001 is kind of on the table as something that the city has to at least consider. Commissioner Griggs.
I lowered my hand. I have always been a proponent of incentivizing rather than the stick from the beginning of these meetings. And so I think the examples that you gave, I will echo what my colleagues have said, are perfect examples of why we can't paint all of the lots with one paintbrush. And, you know, for example, when we thought about the RM2 on State Street, that's a perfect area for the, you know, the housing plus a retail, because those lots along State Street, it fits. Definitely does not fit to have, you know, something in the middle of Lancaster Mall for housing. So I am very strongly in favor of the incentivizing. I'm not sure. I think Commissioner Schweikart's idea is an interesting one to pursue. I would love to know how that pencils out and how that impacts the developers. So those are my 2 cents worth.
Great. Commissioner Pollock.
I previously lived in Orange County, and there a couple of planned communities. The Irvine Ranch, owned by the Irvine family, created Irvine Company, and you might know them from the University of California at Irvine. That whole one massive area, I mean, we're talking lot of land, became the city of Irvine, a very beautifully planned community. And basically how they did this is between the 405 and the 5, they created industrial parks. And even the industrial parks were broken into, part of it was medical, part of it was high tech, part of it was this section, so that people getting to these could come between the freeways and get into their jobs. And above that, they build what they call village centers. And it's basically a village center where you have a grocery store, a bakery, a bank. Around the edges, you have the drive-throughs like the fast foods, the banks, a drive-through pharmacy. Some of them have big pharmacies. They have clothing stores. All this in a basically like your hub, but massive. And then around that were the housing, the single family and the multifamily. And so what you had was a village center, commercial, supporting the residential on the side. And so what you're doing is allowing, and then they don't just have one, they have like one here, one here, one here, one here. And that is to cut down the travel. The only problem with Orange County is it's one of the most expensive places in the nations to live. So it took both parents working. And so when do they do their shopping? On the weekends. So on Saturdays, it was impossible to get into these centers, the parking and the drive-throughs and everything. But I kind of look at the areas that Eunice portrayed as like village center. If you turn those parking lots into little areas of types of commercial or restaurants or things like that people will come to, it starts to look like a village center. So instead of driving down the road, they could just drive there, whether it be Lancaster, whether it be the one off of Liberty, with the one off Liberty is near Kubler, right? Is that down that way? And then, but it starts to look like village center. So to put the requirements of, I think it's the market would, I think the market would be more apt to create these village centers if they didn't have a stick over them. And I do like the idea of, like, if you don't build, I don't think we should have a requirement that they have to have in these sort of like village centers, if you designate them village centers, residential. And then maybe Commissioner Swikart's idea should be on other areas, but maybe we might, instead of just hubs, we might take a look at maybe a new thing called village centers, so that they can take part of that parking lot. And most of the comments that came in here was not to have so much parking, and then create these village centers so that we can again reduce greenhouse gases in the mile we drive. So that's my thought on what you presented today. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other subcommittee members have questions or comments? No? Would it be okay with everyone if I asked if there's any public comment related to this specifically, this option? Okay, so then I'll ask that. If you could, I guess, raise your hand. Jeff Miller, you can, there you go. You have 3 minutes.
Good morning. Thank you for having me and allowing me a few minutes to talk. I've been following this Our Salem thing, which I think is a good thing for the city of Salem. Ultimately, I don't envy the position of Eunice having to navigate all these landmines and things of that nature. But as we were going through this, I was paying attention specifically to the zoning, MU 1, 2, and 3. I like all of it, frankly. However, the requirement to have to do living is unreasonable to me. I think going to the point of saying carrot or the stick, you don't have to require housing, but then we're going to charge you, a developer, a fee that then goes into the housing. I think that that is a reasonable conversation, certainly. However, with the caveat that knowing or being able to budget what that number is. In other words, if that number, you're building $1 million property, which is very small in today's standards, and it's going to cost you $300,000 as an example to put this money into this fund, would negate the ability for someone to build something like that and charge the amount of rent that it would require to support that kind of dollar amount. Rents just won't support it once it gets to a certain point, but then that kind of defeats the purpose. So I think it's a good conversation. It's just a matter of what that looks like. So I'm a big advocate of encouragement, an opportunity, as opposed to a must and a requirement. One last thing I'll say real quickly, and Eunice and I have talked about this multiple times, almost to the point of nausea. I'm sure she's frustrated when we talk about it, but in the non-conform, when a zone is changed from one zone, from CR to now mixed use, if it's there, it's now an allowed non-conforming use, and you go to section 270.005. In section E is in Edward, it says termination of non-conforming uses. And this is something that I've always been concerned with when changing the zone. And that is, if for some reason that property sat vacant for 1 year, you cannot go back to what it was. If it was CR, as an example, and under the current zone, the way it reads, that subsection I just mentioned, 270.005, subsection E is in Edward. It mentions if it sits vacant for a year, you cannot go back to CR. Now it has to become an allowed use within that zone. That's problematic when changing broad strokes of the brush of changing zones. Last thing, because I know I'm on a time constraint, section 4, subsection E, number 4, also talks about if there was destruction to the building of 60%, and whether that be a fire or a vehicle drives into it and destroys part of the building. There again, if it was a retail or whatever the case is, now to rebuild that, it has to go to an MU use. All I'm saying and suggesting to this committee is that that language is addressed somewhere along the line, in addition to not requiring it. Thank you for your time. Sorry if I went over, Eunice.
I don't know if I should address that comment. Maybe I'll wait for everyone and then I'll address that comment. I think Jennifer Martin was next.
I think Kurt was next, but.
Okay, I think Kurt was next.
Yeah.
That's fine, Jen, go ahead.
Okay, right on. Thank you. Jennifer Martin, Mid-Valley Commercial Real Estate. Again, thank you for the opportunity to present. I think Eunice summed up a lot of the concerns that you're going to hear today. Jeff brought up a really great one regarding a non-conforming uses on a go-forward basis, whether it be for vacancy or for destruction of property. Commissioner Schweikart, when she brought up the fee in lieu, again, I agree with Jeff. I think that might be something worth exploring to the extent that the fee doesn't overwhelm or compromise the feasibility of the project. If it's too high, the risks that developer takes in bringing a project to market is something that I don't think a lot of people understand in terms of cost risk, timing risk, absorption of the project, and achieving the rents that you're hoping to achieve, and your expenses staying at the level that you project. So anytime we add a cost, it adds a layer to the returns necessary. And like you illustrated with the State Street project market, Eunice, the market just isn't there yet in terms of rent, and our costs have cost growth has far outpaced rent growth in the past 4 years. The other thing that I would like to point out is in almost 10 years ago, the city implemented a new zone called neighborhood commercial mixed use. That zone, we applied to a property in West Salem. And that property zone has been implemented exactly 0 times in the last 10 years. It required mixed use. And anytime we require something, you're not going to achieve, I don't think, the incentive-based type work that you want to see. People don't do it. And then we'll see a stagnation in the marketplace and we won't see the types of projects that we're hoping to see. And I think anytime we create an atmosphere of welcoming developers with incentives and saying, here's what we want to create, come create that for us, and here's what we're going to do for you, you will invite the types of developers who want to see the same things that we want to see. The other thing that I wanted to point out is, I think in response to what Commissioner Griggs said, related to the locational discussion along the transit networks, core network that you're pointing out, some of those roads are extremely large and carry upwards of 50,000 cars a day. And to create the warm, homey, walkable feel that we're looking to achieve with this mixed use component just doesn't fit on some of those high traffic transit networks along the frontages. I can't picture an infill project of a half an acre or a complete redevelopment across the street from Fred Meyer really absorbing or filling in the way of the vision that we have today. So thank you for your time.
Thanks. Kurt, Arthur?
Hi, everybody. So from my standpoint, I'm not going to spend time reiterating. I really appreciate what Jeff and Jennifer both had to say. I'm going to stick to a very quick comment then, which is we want to stay as a city. We've had really bad luck with prescriptive land use. So what do I mean by that? If you go way back in time and take a look, for example, at the Salem Futures by its premise was actually a very, very good plan. But one of the reasons that it failed and didn't get enacted was the fact that we were going down the road of doing prescriptive land use and requiring residential up and down the 12th and 13th Street corridors. So I want to stay away from that. I agree kind of what Jeff said, that Commissioner Swigert said, talked about maybe putting in some sort of a fee if you choose not to. And I think there's some merits to having that discussion, but I really want to get this group to think hard about understanding what the laws of supply and demand really are, staying away from prescriptive zoning. I was going to reiterate exactly what Jen said about the other mixed use that and specifically the West Salem parcel, and none of those things have been enacted in the last 10 years. So that's my end. I appreciate what both Jeff and Jen had to say and won't reiterate it any further.
Great, thanks. Marissa Thief?
Good morning. So don't represent any industry. I'm just a citizen here, but I thought I'd put a face to the comments. So I provided some written testimony, and I hope you all had the chance to look at it. But in case you didn't, I will just briefly summarize. So thank you for all the work you're doing. I think this plan is turning out really great, first of all, and I'm excited for it. I wanted to highlight that in order to comply with HB 2001, we have to do some shuffling, and I know that this team and the committee in general is doing that work, but I wanted to encourage folks, this was just mentioned briefly already, the elimination of parking minimums. I would love to see that expanded to a half mile from transit rather than a quarter mile, if not expanded to citywide. So the whole state of California is already committing or about to commit to that half mile buffer. So I think that's pretty doable for Salem as well. So something to consider that wasn't really discussed here quite yet. And part of the reason for that is I think Salem really has an identity problem as the second biggest city in in the state, we feel like a suburb. And I think part of that is because of our zoning, and I'm glad to see that changing. You could call it exclusionary. Certainly, it has had some effects on what we have here today. So, and there's certainly some feelings about parking and street parking and sharing that with neighbors and people who want to move here or have moved here and either weren't able to or are not met with the most friendly intentions. So I'll let you go and read I had a bunch of articles linked into my, into my submission. So please take a look at those if you haven't yet. One is a podcast and it relates parking minimums to NIMBYism and homelessness. And I think they're all really tightly connected if you think about it and stop and slow down and look at that. So that's most of what I had. Maybe some other things to look at would be, I like what I heard about housing or height limits, increasing that. That can help us get to density better. And then also setbacks. I know that was at the commission meeting last week. Yeah, and otherwise, thanks so much. And I'll consider myself a yes in my backyard neighbor. So thanks.
Thanks, Martha. Selena Barnes.
Morning, councilors and commissioners. I'm Selena Barnes, the Willamette Valley Government Affairs Director for local realtor associations, including the Mid-Valley Association of Realtors. And I'll keep my comments really brief, besides echoing what Jennifer, Jeff Miller, and Kurt Arthur have stated. But we would have a difficult time supporting having requirements for multifamily housing. Again, we think that would discourage the developments that you're looking for and potentially discourage investors coming in because of the cost prohibitive nature of that. But we would encourage that you look to incentives or somehow rewarding, bringing in that kind of development. We think through that kind of a model that you're more likely to achieve the goal of bringing in the mixed housing and the affordable housing that you're looking for. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Great. I don't see anyone else's hands raised. So I don't know if the subcommittee has more comments or if we're not doing voting this time. I'm sorry if you're all hoping for the voting. But it'd be good, I guess, to hear generally if there's general agreement. Oh, Commissioner Pollock.
Yes, I wanted to speak about the issue of how wide a street is and how many cars go there. In Huntington Beach, there was a corner. It was one side of it was the 405, the other one was called Beach Road, and then Warner Road. These are very heavily traveled. I would say especially Beach Road and Warner more than Lancaster would be, and they were as wide. And on that corner was a shopping center that pretty much lay dead for quite some time. Burlington used to have a big building there, and they ended up being the only one. It was like a Lancaster at one time was kind of void of tenants, and then it got revitalized. But anyway, when I went back, what they started to do is one part of it they did Bellaterra, which was like, an outdoor shopping area with a lot of different types of stores and theaters and things. And then the other part became the multi-housing, and it was along this, very heavily traveled, very wide, and it really worked. It really worked because it was heavily traveled and because it was near, all of these services and restaurants and Staples and all this other stuff, that it really, really works. So just because it's heavily traveled, the whole idea is to get people off their cars. So if they live and work and play and shop where they shop, where they live, that gets people out of these cars. So I don't think that the fact that the street is heavily traveled, it's not the village look that we're trying to look, it's trying to get reduced greenhouse gases. And of course it's going to look, the aesthetic is wonderful, but I think that just because it's heavily traveled doesn't mean we should exclude the idea of mixed use with residential. But I do agree there's some areas where I don't think it should, maybe the requirement of might be a little draconian. That's what I kind of think. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Commissioner Pollock. Councillor Stapleton.
Thanks. Yeah, I guess I wanted to share just a little bit of my thoughts on the conversation and how it's going. I thought the information that you brought forward was really interesting today. I thought it gave us just really clear visions about, I think over our conversation last time, Lisa, I feel like was kind of trying to caution us about like what this is going to actually look like. And so providing that information has been really helpful for me. Listening to public conversation or public comment, I have some feelings. I think I understand what the conversation is about, but I also feel like when I think about somebody who needs affordable housing, and I think about their life and the life they're living and how many carrots and sticks they have, they have a hell of a lot of sticks. And I don't know if any of you guys have ever been in a lower socioeconomic class or struggled financially at all, or maybe been housing insecure at any point in time in your life, or just this is America, right? So a young family, right? Not maybe feeling very supported by a society around them. So when I think about that class of people, and I think about how many carrots and sticks are there, and the fact that most of them are sticks, and life can be pretty challenging. And then I have a conversation with somebody who wants to come in and definitely take some risks and help a city become the city that it wants to be, and have all those great conversations, which I love and want to have. But then when that conversation is really talking about how we just want carrots and not so many sticks, I think everybody would like more carrots and less sticks. But I think that is the tension that I'm holding right now inside my body and inside my mind. Those, I guess, for me, very conflicting realities. So I don't have any answers or even questions. I just wanted to voice where I am as a human being in this conversation. So thanks for listening.
I guess I'll jump in. Eunice was having computer problems, so hopefully she comes back to lead us. I just wanted to respond to Commissioner Pollock's comment, just to make it clear that all the areas we showed, that we're proposing to rezone to mixed use, and all the examples we gave, aren't saying that those aren't appropriate areas for mixed use. I think a lot of them are really appropriate, and that's why we're proposing to rezone it. It was just more that, would this project have happened if when they came in, we said, you have to have housing as part of your new eye clinic, for example, like maybe you're an eye doctor and you're building an eye clinic. Did you know you need to build apartments with it? And would they have then bought that property and moved forward, or decided, oh, this isn't the property for me because I'm not going to be a tenant or a landlord or whatever. I'm not going to do housing. I'm just going to do an eye doctor or something. So that was kind of where we were coming from with those examples. And I think we're still, our recommendation, like Eunice said, is not to require it, but I think there's still different options, not requiring it, but maybe in some just very limited locations. So if that's where the committee wants us to look, we could, again, come back with that, because I think there are some areas that definitely make more sense for mixed use with housing. based on the type of development that's there, their location throughout town, the street layout, that kind of thing. So that is somewhere we could go. We just want to be really cautious in our recommendation because we are concerned that not only would we not get the housing by requiring it, instead we also wouldn't get the commercial development and could maybe just negatively impact those areas altogether as far as redevelopment. So that's kind of where we're being really cautious. Eunice and I also wanted to respond to the comments from Jeff and Jennifer about the non-conforming uses. To just clarify, maybe we weren't clear on that. Everything that's permitted in their current zone would be permitted in the new zone. So the new zoning is really going to allow housing as a permitted use where it's not today, and then have some design standards. So when you do redevelop it, there's certain things that it would have to look a certain way if you meet that threshold, but it wouldn't then make those uses non-conforming. So if you're a whatever you are today in the CR zone, you would be permitted in the new MU3 zone. So just to clarify that, it's not going to kick these businesses into the non-conforming provisions. So I thought Ashley had her hand up, but then she put it down. Did you have
I was going to ask, that's because I was going to ask you that question, Lisa.
Oh, okay. Great. And I see Eunice is back. So I don't know, Eunice maybe is back. So I guess we're still just looking for some input, how folks are generally feeling on our recommendation. Do you want us to do more? You want to go with the staff recommendation of not requiring it? Yes, Councillor Hoy.
Well, I guess my thought is, kind of like I was saying last time, is I think consistency as much as we can is important. And so we've sort of leaned towards customizable or incentive-based requirements. And so it seems like that makes sense for this as well, instead of just saying outright, you have to have it. I mean, obviously not every situation is the same, or, it's not a cookie cutter approach. We have to have some flexibility. So when we have something that's, maybe not appropriate for housing, or maybe it's appropriate, but not doable, I think we need some options, and we need to create a framework that allows for those variations throughout our city, because the whole city isn't the same, and we need to be flexible. So those are my thoughts right now.
Great. Commissioner Griggs.
I concur with Councillor Hoy. I just think I would be in favor of moving staff recommendation forward.
Can we also take a look at what those the in lieu fee that we were talking about? Can we get maybe a list of options about what that would look like?
Yeah, so I think the council work session tonight is going to start that conversation. Sorry, Councilor Hoy, I don't know if that's what you were going to say. No, so that it will be an option for the council to consider. There's going to be a list of financial incentives that will be introduced at the work session tonight and then brought forward to council later this summer. And so construction excise tax is one of those options. And then Councilor Hoy, if you were going to add.
I was just going to, we heard some concerns about the fee not being too high and that sort of thing. And I guess in my mind, that's a given. We wouldn't want to have a fee that makes this not doable. So, but I don't know what that range is. I don't have any a frame of reference. So it would be helpful for me to get an idea of what we're talking about when we're talking about those kinds of fees. Is it a percentage? Is it like 1%? Is it 10%? I have no idea. So some more information about that would be helpful for me.
Yeah, and I think if the council directs staff to look at that, we would come back with more information. I know in the past, some city staff had met with other cities that have already adopted it. I think Corvallis and Bend, I think, if I remember that correctly, have it. And I think it's usually an amount per 1,000 evaluation of the building. So when they come in, they give us their valuation, and that's how we determine a lot of their fees already. And so then that would be a fee, and the council would set that fee. So
okay.
Definitely could bring back more information on that.
Thank you. You can anticipate a motion tonight.
Great.
Thanks, Lisa. I'm here now on my phone, but I'm going to not share my screen because everything's freaking out. Sorry.
Okay.
And this is Ashley. I just really quickly on that topic, I wanted to say that in my experience, and and this is in real estate development in California, so take that with what you will. Some of what really kind of can make it very difficult for us to move forward with our development has to do with when the fee is expected to be paid. Most communities are very clear in their fee payment schedules, right? They'll say it's this many cents per square foot, this many dollars per unit if it's a residential. So it's it typically is it states it very clearly in the development materials what you would pay. You would know that before you're even kind of like talking about your concept design with the city, if you're doing like a design meeting. And so you're able to kind of build in that cost into your pro forma that you move forward with. I think that the comment though that Jennifer made about kind of the risk that you take bringing a development to market, that some of that has to do with, to me, is that the fluctuations in the construction market, what we're seeing in terms of like materials pricing right now, like lumber has gone through the roof over the last 4 to 6 months, and that's making it very difficult for a lot of projects, because the price that they were got the initial bid for is not the price they can actually buy out their subcontractor for, because of crazy fluctuations in materials. So that's something where the way to perhaps minimize the hardship of an in lieu fee is to make sure that you're not actually requiring it to be paid until they come in to pull their building permit. And that's what for my deals, I know exactly which fees are due when I'm coming in to grab that permit, and by that time, my general contractor will have done all of the kind of like final pricing. We're ready to go. We're ready to, I'm giving them the notice to proceed. We're ready to break ground. So there's less likelihood of fluctuation in your pro forma if that's when you have to pay your fee. You're less likely to have like your budget bust, because you'll have pretty much what you're going to have to pay in your construction costs by the time you want to pull that building permit. So having the fee connected to that time frame, to me, maybe would help.
I think that's great feedback. Thank you, Commissioner Schweikart. And is there any other comments on this one before we move on?
Josh has her hand up.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
So part of the incentivizing, or what you call the toolbox, I go back to this modern land development regulations that the Planning Association put together, and what one is like the expedited review process, because they're talking about streamlining the review and approval process. Important is because infill projects are high risk, lengthy, complex approval process, and makes the development even more riskier and more expensive. So they talk about like the city investing in a designated person that deals with infill review. Also, they talk about fast track permitting, and another one that besides the property tax abatement is infrastructure related incentives. And this is again the carrots rather than the payment for not having, and it's the tax increment financing, and basically like they do the parks where you have your base of your property tax, and then it says here the tax revenue on the increased property value can go to a special fund, and then they could use that infrastructure improvement to attract private investment in infill developments. So basically, this says the tool was originally envisioned as a way to jumpstart redevelopment in distressed urban areas that would see no investment but for the incentive created. but recent trends, however, has broadened it to establish TIF districts to use in suburban or affluent areas such as big box shopping centers. So we're, again, this is about infill. And I think that looking at a lot of different aspects to what we put in our toolbox, besides just that, pay if you don't build the residential, I think would be a great idea to look at as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Commissioner Pollock. Oh, I'm going to keep saying Councillor and Commissioner wrong. Thank you. Let's see, I don't see any more hands raised. So Eunice, are we?
Yes, move on to the next one. Sorry for the crazy. So the next idea we wanted to kind of dive back into was the idea of requiring middle housing and hubs. We're going to first start with middle housing. Austin, can you advance the slide? So if you remember last time we spoke, we had brought an idea that the home builders had first brought to us about, instead of requiring middle housing in a subdivision, establish a minimum density in the RS zone. So essentially our single family zone. So when the land is subdivided, there's some flexibility in how they meet that density. So there could be middle housing, there could be small lots, big lots. And so as a kind of follow-up to that, we wanted to talk about kind of what should that minimum density be? Should it be applied to all subdivisions or just large ones? And if just large ones, what's large? So we went back through kind of our recent subdivisions that were approved in 2019, 2020 to again look at what was the gross density, the average. And as you can see here, it was about 5.7, but we took out, one of the outliers, which was a very dense small project, and it's more likely to be closer to 5.2 dwelling units per acre. We did meet again with the home builders to talk about kind of what they thought was feasible and reasonable in terms of a minimum density, and we talked about 5.5 dwelling units per acre as being feasible, but still increasing the housing density. They also suggested looking again at different densities for large versus small subdivisions. So based on that input, we did some research again to look back at our approved subdivisions. And if the minimum density in the single family zone were set at 5.5 dwelling units per acre, 8 of the 12 subdivisions that were approved recently would have had more units. So as an example, one of the subdivisions that was roughly 20 acres with 88 units had a density of 4.4 units per acre. But again, if that density was pushed up to 5.5, we would have gotten 21 more units. Whether that's smaller lots, townhouses, or middle housing types, it's really kind of creating that flexibility to get a higher density. We looked at a smaller project that was roughly 5 acres, and the density was fairly high. It was 5.1. So if we again pushed it to 5.5 units per acre, we would have gotten 2 more units or more flexibility. So you can see that it's the density and the number of units we would get if we actually established minimum density in the single family zone, which we don't have today, really depends on the location and the size. There's different factors. So not just necessarily. So again, this small one is a higher density than the bigger one in this case. Next slide, Austin. Thanks. We then looked at sizes as well. What is our average size of a subdivision? And it was roughly 18 acres. We did take out East Park, which is a very large one. It brought the average down to 10.8. We also took a very, very small one out, and it's roughly 11.8 acres. The median size was 8.4 acres. And so we've talked with the home builders about a large subdivision being about 20 acres. And only 2 of the subdivisions approved in 2019 to 2020 would have been considered that large subdivision over 20 acres. So we're recommending a minimum density in the single family zone of 5.5, but for all subdivisions, whether it's small or large, we would still allow adjustments. So if for some reason there's a unique circumstance and you couldn't meet that, you could apply for an adjustment. So any questions on that before we, Councillor Hoy.
I'm curious specifically why you didn't think it was the best approach to have sort of a layered, like, something different for smaller subdivisions. Is it just because we haven't had that experience, or was there something more that drove that?
Yeah, we did look at, the builders were telling us that the bigger the subdivision, the more flexibility they have then to kind of meet a requirement. But when we looked at the range of subdivisions, a lot of our subdivisions are actually closer to the 10, not the 20. And a lot of the, and there wasn't a direct correlation that the larger subdivisions were higher density or lower density necessarily. And so some of the smaller subdivisions we are seeing be approved are closer to that 5 units per acre or more. So it didn't seem like there was necessary that, just because you were small, you couldn't achieve a higher density, or we aren't achieving a higher density.
So I guess instead of looking at, that seems like kind of a little bit of a back look, and this is about where we want to be in the future.
Yeah.
So it seems like we ought to be, I would like more information, just because I don't have the frame of reference. Like what would be a reasonable goal to try to move to, and would there be a differentiation? Because I'm thinking the more build out we get, the smaller these subdivisions are going to be. There aren't going to be a lot of big ones left in the city, I wouldn't think.
Yeah, we could look at kind of the size of the different properties, but it also has to do with ownership, obviously. We were looking forward in terms of the 5.5 as a recommendation going forward as the minimum density.
No, I understood that part, but it seemed
okay.
like you use the past to inform, and as opposed to what's our goal.
Yes, that's correct. We did look back and see kind of what can be built and what has been built. You're right. I think there are some builders here that maybe could talk to some of the on the ground future look if you want to do that now. If there's other questions or comments first from the subcommittee members.
I would be interested in hearing from them.
Okay. I guess if you want to raise your hand, I think Mark Gurenz and Mike Erdman are here.
I think Mark was going to.
Oh, you're raising your hand. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't know how to raise my hand on the screen evidently. So, but I appreciate all of the information and the time that staff has taken to talk to our group about how to increase densities, and appreciate the fact that they were receptive to our idea about using minimum density as opposed to trying to create hubs or try to start designating places to try to have the medium density. And there's appears to be a lot of different ways to go through and calculate what types of densities we are achieving today. I know Mike did some research on it this morning. I did some research on some of the developments that we put together here in the last couple of years, and with both large and small subdivisions, and we're running just under 5 units per acre as for gross density for that, and that would include utilizing East Park, which is a very dense subdivision and part of that. But we have a lot of subdivisions and a big push right now for wider lots, because that seems to be what people are still in this area, still pushing for their single story ranch style house. So that said, but I think that we agree that a minimum density of about 5.5 is achievable. I think there are some things we want to be sure that everybody on the committee doesn't overlook when we start thinking about that. So when you start shoving up the density on these subdivisions, whether you do it by using smaller lots or whether you do it by using middle housing for that, be aware that that also increases other elements that have to go into that project in some respect. For instance, stormwater facilities, both for water quality, for treatment and quantity, are all going to be increased by that. So if you increase your density, then you're pushing the amount of hard surface that we have and the amount of area to be treated. So there will be some impacts on the usable space that's within these developments that gets sucked up and utilized by increasing the size of those facilities. And so that's that's an element to make sure that doesn't get overlooked. And the smaller projects will likely have a harder time with those types of things because you're struggling to find a place for those types of facilities in a smaller project anyway. And then when you start trying to find a space and start making it bigger, then it doesn't take very much change before all of a sudden you lose a lot, so the density is harder to achieve. And I do believe that particularly if you get down below 5 acres, that's going to be where those types of impacts are going to be much more pronounced. And if you're trying to increase your minimum density to 5.5 and that gets you 2 more units, but all of a sudden you lose a unit or you lose a lot because of that, then we may not be achieving it. May force developers to make other choices in what types of lots they create, which may not necessarily be to the best advantage of the community. So if we can think about 5 acres as kind of on the small end, and that's different than what we talked to Eunice about. We think that from 5 up, we can make it work, and we can figure out ways to help improve that density and achieve that 5.5. And I think you're going to find some projects that where they'll strive to get over 5.5 to make it work and to do it. But I do know that there's a distinct group of builders that are trying to build more affordable, and there's a fairly good sized group that are trying to build for the marketplace, which is striving for those wider lots. And so I know that'll be, those types of projects will be harder for the developers to get their heads around that. And I think you'll find a bigger use of middle housing, like duplexes and triplexes within those, in order to achieve that density rather than shrinking lot sizes. We got a really beautiful subdivision that was submitted by John Miller here recently, and it's going to be great for what he's trying to achieve out there. But if you look at your gross density on that, it's really low. And I think that if that project had to try to strive to hit this type of density, it would change the pattern of what he's trying to do there. So I know it's a balance, and I know that it's trying to find a way to get to work, but we've talked about it and we've studied it, and we think we can make that 5.5 minimum density work on anything that's 5 acres or larger. I'd be happy to answer questions that you might have of us, and I would throw in the other thing that's hard right now is topography, because a lot of the properties that we're dealing with have a lot of topographic features to it. So those things that will also enter into how well you can fit a higher density in some of these areas, but we think we can make it work.
Thanks, Mark. Any questions for Mark, or do we want to go to Mike? Mike, go ahead. Herdman.
There we go. Thanks. No, I appreciate it. And as Mark said, thanks to Eunice and staff, because we've had some good discussions with them that I think have been really productive. I think what we've said to staff, I'll say to you, is I think we're seeing, frankly, a lot of market interest in providing middle housing, because, right now with just the land costs and development costs, the lots that we're developing right now, it's pretty tough to get below about 150,000 in Salem. And when you're buying a lot at 150,000, you really can't do affordable housing. So there's absolutely a market, I think, if we can make those lot sizes, dividable and provide middle housing. I think it allows the market to respond. And we're hearing a lot of interest from developers looking to go down that path. So of course, we just want to make sure that as we look at a minimum density, that it's realistic. And Mark has kind of talked about that. We do need to be able to make sure that while we do middle housing, that we've got large enough lots to accommodate, what the market's calling for right now. And as I said, with construction costs, development costs being as high as they are, there's definitely a need for those larger lots to accommodate that somewhat more expensive housing. So it's a matter of finding that balance. I do think that we need to, as we think about kind of minimum densities, realize that there are going to be parcels that chunks of those are undevelopable. So we want to make sure that that's accounted for when we look at density. And you think at perhaps some of the subdivisions we've seen lately that may have large power line easements, the BPA easement that goes through the North Star property. We've got other parcels that may have a creek or a wetland area. And so you've got big setbacks that they're simply not developable areas of that project. So we'd want to make sure that those lands effectively get removed so that you're not expecting somebody can achieve a higher density when a chunk of that land really can't be developed anyways. So that's an important consideration. And finally, as Mark mentioned, I think there should be a minimum size threshold, because when we went into this discussion, and of course the initial discussion was talking about requiring middle housing in large new subdivisions, we weren't looking at all projects, only larger ones. And so perhaps 20 acres is too large. But as Mark alluded to, you've got topographical issues, you've got parcel shape issues, and of course trying to accommodate stormwater and the like. When you're on a small parcel, it can be really tough to achieve that density. And so there really does need to be a minimum size threshold before this kicks in, because doing it on the really small parcels could make it impossible to develop and achieve those densities. So that's really all the comments I had. So I appreciate your time.
I had a question, Eunice, for Mike.
Yeah, go ahead.
So is your recommendation then to just not set a minimum for less than a 5-acre parcel?
Correct.
Are you saying?
You get to those small parcels, and as I said, be it the parcel shape or topography, it's just a lot tougher to get that flexibility on a small parcel.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
Phil Carver.
Thank you, Eunice, and thanks for offering the opportunity for comments. I'm Phil Carver, and I represent 350 Salem, a climate change group. And I think that there's a misplaced concept here that it's got to be easy and almost effortless to achieve these goals. We really need a sea change in how we build houses. And if it's going to be 5.5 units per acre, then I think we need to go back to requiring middle housing. These averages, Kim, Eunice, I'd be interested if these averages you have, if those included any middle housing. And I'm getting the impression that they didn't. And so if you have several middle housing units in a development of 5 acres or more, then you're going to be able to achieve the densities of 7 or more. And so I think that if you're not going to set the minimum at 7 or higher, then we have to go back to the idea of requiring middle housing in developments of 5 acres or more. That's all I have, unless there's questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Phil. Any questions for Phil? And I don't think those subdivisions, they may say some of them may have included townhouses, but again, duplex, triplex, fourplex they aren't allowed in our single family zone currently, generally. So I think you're correct in that they're largely single family subdivisions that we were looking at in the past.
Okay, thank you, Eunice.
Any questions from the committee or any thoughts based on the input?
I'm comfortable with staff's recommendation on the 5.5 units per acre minimum requirement and properties larger than 5 acres.
I guess I haven't settled yet on where I'm at with this, so I'm not ready to say I'm good with it or not yet.
Okay, Commissioner Levin.
I'm kind of there with Councillor Hoy that I'm not really sure, and especially after the last meeting and kind of going through the paces and making notes and ending at a point that then having a conversation with a colleague afterwards and getting my my decision changed. I really feel like I want to know more about kind of where we're at now and what those standards have been and what this would look like as far as lot sizes and whatnot, and if it would make a constructive difference. But I do think that from my experience in real estate in general, that there would have to be different tiers to the standards of units per acre, because the small acreage parcels are an easy example. The uniqueness of the topography that we have here with a river running through our city creates some physical boundaries, and then we have wetlands that all play into factors about how a subdivision is made. And it's so I hate to start giving opinion again and not really knowing that much about residential subdivision development. And that's in my day-to-day profession, that's not an industry that I work with. I focus on industrial real estate. And so I don't have just the common knowledge of some of the mechanics of how residential subdivisions work today to feel confident in my decision. But I feel like I would agree with Commissioner Griggs that there would need to be a split at least at the 5 acres. And then I'd also might as well propose an additional split tiering the densities as acreage goes up. I don't know.
Thanks. Commissioner Pollock.
Okay, so would you clarify for me, because when I'm looking at the zoning option sheet that you sent us in the very beginning, number 6 says establish a minimum density in single family residence zone near the core network. So it sounds to me like we're talking about all over, not just near the core network.
Right. And so that's correct. There's 2 different ideas right now. The number 6 option you're referring to was the higher density, the 15 units per acre near the core network that we talked about last time. We're now talking about, I think it's option 4, if I can go by memory. It previously said require middle housing.
Right.
In large subdivisions.
Yeah, multifamily in, it says, it says here, require neighborhood hubs and or middle housing in large subdivisions.
Yes. And so when we had talked about that idea, then the home builder suggested an alternative route to getting middle housing, of establishing the minimum density.
Yeah, that's right. I forgot that.
That's okay.
I still go by the point that Commissioner Levine pointed out, like the last time we met, that the minimum density, and that way the builder can determine how that's going to be, whether some part of it's going to be larger housing, some part of it with middle housing, and some part of it maybe, this smaller lots. I like the fact of the flexibility of it. So even if they put a minimum, would that allow the developer to be flexible on how he meets that minimum?
Yes, that's the idea, is that by setting a minimum density in the single family zone, there would be different ways they could meet it, whether it's small lots or townhouses or duplexes, triplexes, and they could kind of meet the number of units per acre. So the minimum density, however they best saw that fit that site.
Yeah, I really do like the whole idea of flexibility, because Mr. Grintz had pointed out, there's still a demand for larger lots. But yet then there's also a demand for the lower and more affordable housing and a single family, and then the middle housing, whether it be they own it or they rent it, and whether parts of those can be actually designated as affordable housing. So I like the flexibility of it. So yeah, I think I like I agree with Commissioner Griggs. I like the minimum density with the 5 acre minimum, at least. Starting at minimum, anything less than five would not have the density requirement. So
thanks, Commissioner Pollock. We can always bring back information to our last meeting in July if there's any piece of information you want, you can either let us know or let us know later, and we're happy to do that research. I know there's, interest in, I guess, a little bit more clarification or research, and we're happy to do that. So you don't have to land anywhere right now. It sounds like there's some agreement that maybe there needs to be a break at 5 acres, but it's whether that 5.5 or even more flexibility or scaling needs to happen. So if you have any thoughts right now in terms of additional research you'd like us to do, we're happy to do that. Or we can just have more conversations and bring back more information next time anyhow. Because we are going to hopefully at the next meeting take a final look at all 6 options and ask for your recommendation on those going forward. So maybe I'll pause there. And then we did want to talk at least about the neighborhood hub idea in large subdivisions. If we want to move on from middle housing, or if you have any additional comments now, move on. Okay, thanks, Austin. So this is again having to do with subdivisions. And last time we met, everyone seemed to lean towards requiring neighborhood hubs, which again would be a zone that would allow single family, but also allow for the opportunity for small scale businesses in large subdivisions. But again, it's that question of what is large. We did look at, again, the sizes. Austin, do you want to advance the slide? Sizes. And we think for neighborhood hubs, 20 acres actually is large. The thinking is that neighborhood hubs, as we have proposed them, would be limited to collectors and minor arterials. Generally around intersections is kind of the ideal, as opposed to just kind of anywhere in a subdivision. So even if it applied to every 20-acre subdivision, not necessarily every subdivision would have to designate a neighborhood hub zone. We would also look again at kind of distances between hubs. So if for some reason there was a subdivision that already had a designated hub, or even an existing area that had a designated hub zone, or mixed use corridor, right? There was already services nearby, that a new subdivision right next to it wouldn't necessarily have to provide the hub zone. So we would be applying kind of the same criteria for siting for neighborhood hubs across the city, similar in the same way to a new subdivision, if that makes sense. So this is an example. This one's on Devon's. It's close to 20 acres. So you could see it may make sense to put it at the intersection. I can't read. Is that Lone Oak?
Yes.
Sorry, I'm on my phone. Thank you. So, perhaps in that area, there's not a lot of services. There's not mixed use zone. There's not a commercial zone. There's no hubs proposed. So perhaps it would make sense at that intersection. If there was one, again, right next door that already had a hub, it wouldn't necessarily need one. Oh, Commissioner Pollock.
These hubs are go along for what I was speaking about, the village centers, where again, if you had this services, these businesses where had these services where they walk or not even drive that far to get to them. And again, I agree that they should be on the corners there and stuff. I think these hubs are almost like a miniature version of what I was thinking about or talking about the village centers. Obviously, they wouldn't have a large grocery store, but they could have something like like that wonderful Mexican grocery store off of Lancaster. I think it's El Ranchito, where you have the place has got a bakery, a restaurant, a butcher shop, and a grocery store all in one area, and then you can have the other supportive services around there. So yeah, I like these hubs because again, they could be like a mini version of the village center that I was speaking to. I know we've had some testimony that they're not quite thrilled about it, but I think when we're looking at keeping people out of their cars or minimizing the drive times, I think these village hubs are very useful for that.
Thanks, Commissioner Pollock. Commissioner Schweikart.
Thank you. Yeah, it feels like this one kind of requires some data. So a couple of things I was thinking about was, are we talking about, I'm trying to think of like in terms of like what opportunities there are for new subdivisions of 20 acres plus to be going into within the existing city limits, or perhaps within the existing UGB, and how many, where realistically would we be adding subdivisions of this size? That was just one thing I thought about, is that like, I know when the planning commission, was it last year or the year before, we approved some real large subdivisions that were up in the northeast side of town, right at the city limits. And a couple of those probably were over 20 acres. But I don't think we've seen those very frequently. So I was trying to think of like how many places would this end up occurring if 20 acres was the size that we went with for a large subdivision. And then the other thing is that, Eunice, you said that depending on how close another neighborhood hub was, or how close another commercial center was to something like the one you're showing on the screen. And I was thinking, like, are we talking about saying that a neighborhood hub would not have to go in if you had a certain amount of commercial within a certain radius? What's the standard that we're setting in terms of like, how close do you have to be to commercial amenities for you not to have to put in a neighborhood hub, or to not include a neighborhood hub in a large subdivision?
Yeah, I appreciate that. Lisa, did you want to say something?
Not to the second question, I'll let you answer that, Eunice, but to the first question, I think that when Eunice was showing the previous data, like in the last 2 years, we've only had 2 subdivisions over 20 acres. Some of it might be hard to look at, the map and say, oh, here's this many lots or tracts that are over 20 acres, and then therefore they could be subdivisions, just because we see developers buy multiple, ownership lots and bring them together. So it's kind of hard to know, just looking on the current configuration of a parcel, that, oh, these are all 8 acres, so they're not 20, but the developer might buy 3 in a row, right? And so then all of a sudden they have a 20-acre subdivision. So that's kind of hard for us to figure out. But generally, yes, all the land that's going to be a subdivision more than 20 acres is going to be at the edge of the city. So we're talking far South Salem, far West Salem. There's not really much left in North Salem now that we've had North Star and East Park. So we are really talking at the edges of town, and those are really the areas that aren't served by commercial services. So I think Eunice can talk about the proximity for the hubs.
Yeah, as the zone is proposed right now, we're proposing a distance from other mixed use zones, commercial zones, or neighborhood hub zones of at least a 1/4 mile. But I think, as Lisa said, most of these areas are way further away than a 1/4 mile. Commissioner Griggs.
Yeah, and maybe you're going to cover this in a minute, so I do apologize if I'm jumping ahead. What are we talking about? A specific size for the neighborhood hub that would be the requirement, or just a neighborhood hub?
Yeah, we haven't landed on should it be a specific size, except for the cap. What we've heard is folks don't want the hubs to take over single family areas. And so we had said in the proposed zone up to 2 acres, including streets. So it couldn't be a kind of a massive area within a subdivision. So this is just our recommendation. What we talked about the 20 acres, and then incorporating kind of those criteria for hubs. So it would have to be on a collector or minor arterial, at least a 1/4 mile away from other hubs, mixed use commercial zones, similar to what we're proposing in the actual zone itself. Any questions? We have one other option to get to, but I'm happy to obviously take question comments. Councilor Hoy.
Thanks, Eunice. Did you consider a size lower than 20 acres, or was that just sort of the standard and you went with it? I'm just wondering, like, are we going to create a rule that never gets implemented because we don't really have any more 20-acre subdivisions that would be suitable for this?
We could consider a lower number. I think when we looked at the average size, it was closer to 10 or 11 acres as our subdivisions in the last 2 years.
Okay, thank you. The other question I guess I have is about, you kind of alluded to it. What if you have multiple owners? What if you have a developer who only does residential, they don't do commercial, how would that impact? And I guess the whole idea of, well, because this neighboring subdivision has one and this one doesn't, and almost, I just am having flashbacks to the Lone Oak Bridge, and am worried that we might be getting into a situation where, well, we thought this was going to be the case, and then these were the rules, but then that turned out to not be the case, and now these aren't the rules. I just get concerned about that kind of springboarding of rules.
Yeah, so I think something really important to remember with the neighborhood hub is that you can just build a house and have a house forever. So it's not a requirement to do commercial. So even in the locations across town and existing neighborhoods where we're proposing hubs, we could potentially see that we don't get any businesses there, either because the property owners, maybe don't want to do it, or the person they sell the house to doesn't want to do it, or the market doesn't support it. So that could be what happens in newer subdivisions as well. Like, okay, the developer says maybe these 4 corner lots in this intersection are going to be my designated hub. It's a note that we make, and so when someone ever calls and says, what can I do here? I say, well, you buy that house. Oh, also you could do a business here, this kind of business under these, situation or limitations. And they say, great. And they never do a business. So, or we could get lots of hubs, and that's great as well. Because it's an unknown, situation for Salem and a new idea. It's hard to know if any of them will happen. But the idea is that the lots would be designated for it. So it would just be designated. This would just be designating it through the subdivision to say these are the lots that allow it in the future. It wouldn't be that the lots would be like held vacant until someone comes in and like builds a business or something.
Okay, I mean, I knew that was the case with the existing subdivisions and existing land. I didn't realize that that's what you were saying here with new subdivisions. I took the word required to mean to actually have a hub, as opposed to have zoning that allowed a hub. So
Yeah.
thank you for that clarification. That helps a lot.
And I think some folks on here have alluded to, and some of the testimony you've received have been in opposition to specific hubs that we've potentially picked for existing areas throughout town. And a lot of that testimony will say, but it's great to require it in new areas, right? Where people maybe know what they're buying into or something, or in areas that are less served by services than maybe some of our existing neighborhoods. So that's why we thought, okay, well, maybe not every hub we have potentially picked so far is the right location for a hub. But if this is a good idea, it should be something that we don't want to have to go in 10 years and say, okay, these existing neighborhoods, you guys didn't exist when we did our Salem. Now we're going to go through and pick hubs for you. Like, instead it would be more organic and happen with the subdivision. It's kind of our idea.
I'm definitely good with requiring the zoning in the subdivisions that allow it. I mean, what's the downside?
Right.
To me, there is no downside to this. So yeah, I don't have any issue with that at all.
But I heard maybe potentially smaller subdivisions.
Yeah, I mean, again, what's the downside to that? It's not required, but you're just required to have the zone that allows it. So it seems like it allows more flexibility instead of eliminating more flexibility, but it doesn't require it. So what I think we should go lower than 20 for that. Yeah.
Well, doesn't it, just for clarification, it requires the zone for that hub to occur in a subdivision, whatever the size is going to be. But then that precludes the development of that parcel for anything other than a hub, correct?
No.
No, go ahead.
So they could build a house on
Yes.
a lot parcel that was zoned for a hub.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Commissioner Pollock.
Yes, I just wanted to point out that that you have a definition of hubs, and that there's one of the issues brought up in some of the testimonies that we got previously was, oh, we don't want a gas station there, but the hubs actually has a definition plus allowed uses, and that if anybody's listening or curious, that they should take a look at what would be allowed in the hubs, and that would basically more user friendly, more friendly to the surrounding, residential area. So just wanted them to point out it's like it won't be a gas station.
I appreciate that comment. We have gotten some questions and concerns more broadly in the community about neighborhood hubs and the uses allowed. And we are going to actually take another look at maybe refining that list to eliminate or prohibit some specific uses that people didn't want, like a liquor store or methadone clinic, just to kind of refine that list. So yes, it would be a very specific list. Commissioner Schweikart.
Yeah, to that end, I remember our State Street corridor conversations about what uses would be allowed in that mixed use zone. We started kind of talking through that. So it might be a good way to think back. I mean, that because there was so much community feedback provided when we were talking about those uses that were allowed. So it might be good to go back to those conversations as an opportunity to narrow the uses that would be allowed in a neighborhood hub, because I think that the market would already probably slim it down for us, and so you're not going to see like a car dealership on a lot, in a subdivision. But it's always good to at least in order to address the public's concern that they provided on the comments on the map, to address what uses are allowed. The other thing I was going to say is, could you go back to the slide? I think that you had provided the average acreage that we've been seeing. Did you provide?
Thanks, Austin. Yeah, there it is. Thanks.
Awesome. So in 2019, 2020, average acreage was 10.8 without the crazy East Park project. So yeah, to me, I mean, I would agree with Councilmember Hoy's comment. I mean, like, let's go less than 20 acres. Like, if the average is what we're seeing is 10.8, let's say 10 acres and above. I mean, I think that the point was really well made, which is that we're already allowing flexibility in the uses. So we're not actually prohibiting the developer to have flexibility in what is provided. It's just that there is the ability to have more. So yeah, let's take it down to 20.
Great. Councillor Hoy.
Thank you. Following up on 2 points from Commissioner Schweikart, I think if the neighborhood hub concept in existing areas is ever going to be accepted by the community, we're going to have to put up more guardrails. And so your comment, Eunice, I think is a good one. I think the more guardrails you can put up, that's the only thing that is going to allow people's comfort level to get to a place where we need it to be. Because right now it doesn't seem like it's there. And I think the more guardrails you can put in to give them assurances that they don't have some of these things that we keep hearing about in neighborhood meetings. I think anything we can do to eliminate that possibility, the better. So guardrails for existing. Now, as it relates to these new subdivisions, I agree with Commissioner Schweikart. I think 10's good, but I would love to hear also from, if we have any members of the public still here or who are watching and want to give us feedback. I said that what's the downside? Okay, am I missing something? Is there really a downside? So I would love to hear that if you think there is a downside for requiring these zones in these new subdivisions. If there's something I'm not thinking of, I would love to hear about it.
Sure. I don't know if anyone from the public, I think, Mike Erdman has his hand raised. Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, and we're not opposed necessarily to the requirement, but I think when you talk about what are the drawbacks, I think the concern is that if you have lots in a subdivision designated as neighborhood hub, does it make the surrounding lots more difficult to sell potentially when the market's not as hot as it is today? And so kind of for that same reason, you may be seeing the existing neighborhoods opposed to a neighborhood hub in their area. You know, if you're looking at buying a lot in a subdivision and it's got a potential commercial use next door, you may be concerned about the traffic that comes with delivery trucks or parking or all the rest of that. So that's the concern, I think, is that potentially it could make surrounding lots less desirable.
Thank you for that. Thank you. I guess in today's climate, and of course this won't exist forever, I'm thinking, heck yeah, I'll buy it and I'll triple my money in a few months. But yeah, thank you for that. I do appreciate it.
Great. I don't know if there's more questions or comments on that size. It looks like looking at maybe a smaller threshold, not the 20 acres, maybe closer to 10, we can look at that and maybe provide some more guardrails generally on the neighborhood hub zone. We can bring that information back in the next meeting. And I just want to make sure that I think everyone from the public has talked, but if not, I just want to make sure we don't run out of time for the last remaining public comment, if that's okay. Is there anyone that hasn't spoke or would like to? No? Okay. So thank you for that discussion. The last zoning option was what Commissioner Pollock had referred to, the minimum density within along the core network, where we landed on 15 units per acre. So a higher density in the single family zone where we want to see more housing through redevelopment along the core network. So last time we met, we were leaning towards, again, that 15 units per acre within a quarter mile of the core network. And the question came up, how much vacant land do we have generally in the single family zone along the core network? So Austin did some research and we have less than, next slide, Austin. Less than 100 lots, or less than 2%, are currently vacant. And so we also just looked at, what does it look like? So this is a vacant property, about 12,000 square feet near commercial. And if we set the minimum density at 15 units per acre, this property would have to build 4 units or apply for an adjustment. Again, if that 15 units per acre were in place along the core network. And then this is along Market Street. It's a smaller lot, roughly 8,000. And with the minimum density of, again, of 15 units per acre, would be 3 units would be required or an adjustment. So some of the things that we're thinking about going forward, next slide, Austin, is, next slide, sorry, is, we want to make sure that existing single family housing, existing housing can be rebuilt and enlarged, so they can do an addition. We want to make sure that ADUs are exempt. So regardless of minimum density, someone can add an ADU. And then we've been looking a lot at other communities that have minimum densities and the exemptions that they allow. And should there be exemptions, for example, for a really large property that they just want to kind of carve out their single family home and develop the rest of it at a higher density, or just kind of other ideas, because this will impact, if as it's proposed today, not just vacant lots, but existing lots. So if you have a single family home or a very large lot and you come in and say, I want to do an ADU, great. But if you say, I want to add 1 more unit, but your lot is really large, we may say, well, based on 15 units per acre, you actually have to do 3. And so we just want to make sure that we are thinking about all the different kind of implications and kind of what exemptions in addition to these might make sense. And so we're taking a look at other cities and kind of what they're doing. Oh, can someone read what's in the chat? Sorry, I can't read the chat.
That was actually a couple of comments that I had just thrown out for the general and for just for maybe staff for next meeting, is bringing back up that conversation about lowering the site standard size for when to require a neighborhood hub zone. I thought maybe I think you've got a list of available land inventory, and if we just broke it down by individual lot sizes and identified, how many 10-acre or larger sites we have, maybe that would help give some framework to the conversation.
Okay. Anyone else from the committee? I think Phil Carver from the public has his hand up. Okay, go ahead, Phil.
Thank you, Eunice. I want to bring up an item that hasn't been discussed, but is a concern to the low-income and minority communities, is that to not allow for gentrification that reduces density. So one of the concerns would be somebody buying up 2 lots and putting a really big single-family house on that. And it's a question, is there anything in the zoning now that would prevent that? And if not, what options are being considered to do that? Because we certainly don't want the densities to go down with gentrification. It's a question, really. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, with the changes to the UDC that the Planning Commission is looking through in light of SB 2001, that you wouldn't be able to have over a certain square footage maximum on a single family lot. Isn't that right, Lisa?
I don't think so.
I don't think so.
So in here, okay, hold on.
I think for the new middle housing, yes, but I don't think for a single family. Although I would say the scenario Mr. Carver threw out there is, I mean, something we never see at this point. Now, obviously, there could be market, forces that would, result in that in the future. But I think what we've been seeing instead is people going the opposite route. Dividing the parcels, adding more housing, doing property line adjustments to make lots so that you can, build 2 houses where you can only build 1. It's very, we don't really see people buying 2 lots and tearing down a house and combining it. It's just, I don't know that I've ever seen anyone do that actually in Salem. Definitely not what I would think of near the core. I've seen people combine vacant lots, like in West Salem or South Salem and existing subdivisions to build a larger house, but not to tear down housing to do that.
Yeah, you're right. I was thinking minimum lot size, not maximum. I was forgetting.
We did, speaking of, is that me echoing? We did call the state to make sure that if we established a minimum density like this near the core network, we wouldn't be in violation of House Bill 2001. And they did say, yes, we cannot establish or apply a maximum density, but we can apply a minimum density because they are looking for more housing choices from the state level in terms of House Bill 2001. Any other questions or comments from, I guess, the public or the subcommittee? Mark, your hand is raised. Go ahead.
Thank you. I just was kind of clarifying what I understand the committee's expectations would be. So if you're thinking like that example you showed of an 8,400 square foot piece of property that would, by this requirement, would require a minimum of 3 units, are you envisioning then the use of a townhouse style or single family attached style housing? Because you certainly wouldn't be anything conventional detached housing that would fit in that kind of density. And then as a follow-up to that, then are we really better off trying to do it this way, or should we be trying to create some kind of multifamily overlay zone that would fit in here, that would allow, when these redevelop, that they have to redevelop at a density, but they'd be allowed to use something other than single family attached in order to try to achieve that? Because I think it's going to be difficult with what you have in that area near the core to do it in a way that will be pleasing when it's done. But that would just be, that's just my comment based on my experience of trying to redevelop parcels and apartments and townhouse style projects, and it just seemed to be like it might be difficult. But anyway, thanks for listening.
Great, thanks, Mark. We were thinking though it could be something, for example, like a triplex. So it doesn't have to be a land division. Could just be on the lot. So a triplex or a cottage cluster or a duplex with an ADU behind, you know, something where they could be attached or detached under the draft rules for the House Bill 2001. So I think there'd be a lot of flexibility, but we just, when we started thinking about platted lots that are near the core and what maybe somebody thought that they were going to be able to do when they went through for their partition or subdivision, if we then say, well, actually now based on those, each one has to be a duplex, and maybe that wasn't their intent and that wasn't the notice to the public and that wasn't, you know, kind of the outreach, is a little bit different than what is potentially happening across the city, where we say any lot can now be a duplex or triplex, versus these lots have to be a triplex or duplex or something based on their location. So the more we thought about it, we just wanted to get feedback and make sure there was a clear understanding of what it could potentially mean for some of these lots that we'd be requiring this type of housing unless they went the adjustment route, which is, as you know, time, cost, money, et cetera, and uncertainty. And so that's what we started looking at what other cities do for exemptions and how do they handle that, and if that's something we should be considering. So Mike Erdman has his hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of point out that, you know, if we're looking at a minimum density there of 15 per acre, you know, it really is multifamily. And the concern I've got is that there's very little, if any, of that land is vacant. You know, this is all typically, you know, platted lots that have got a house on it already. And so if you have somebody that has a larger piece of property, let's say they've got a 1/4 acre lot with a house on it, it's just not financially feasible probably to buy that property for 600, 700,000, whatever it may be, demolish the house and then put up the 4 or 5 units that you might need to meet that zoning. So I'm thinking if you have somebody, let's say, that has that larger lot, they've got a house on it, perhaps they do want to put a detached duplex on there. But of course, that wouldn't meet the density requirement. And so, you know, think about what you're requiring here may actually dissuade people from doing that type of middle housing that you really want to encourage. And so just think about doing those additional exemptions because you want to encourage people to add these units. You don't want the standards to be so tight that they say, this doesn't make sense, I'm just going to leave it where it is right now.
Great, thank you, Mark. Mike, sorry. Any other comments, questions, recommendations? Okay, so Eunice, we will continue to look at what some exemptions should be and
Yes.
bring the final recommendation the next meeting.
Yes.
Great.
Sorry about that. Got disconnected again.
And maybe for the next meeting, you could give us sort of a written recap of the current state of affairs. Like what have we, I know we haven't voted on anything necessarily, but we've kind of had some agreements. Just kind of outline all of those things and give us like the current, like, this is where we're at right now. Unless we keep in mind. That'd be helpful.
No problem. I apologize we didn't do a memo this time, but we will do a memo in advance of the next meeting. We can summarize where we landed and then some of the information of kind of what we'll be talking about the last meeting.
And if we could get that earlier rather than later, Eunice, and I apologize for asking for that, but I think it would be helpful for the community to be able to review it and digest it before our meeting and then give feedback to us and allow us to review and digest their feedback, which, you know, more than just a few hours before the meeting to really understand what, you know, what the feedback is saying. That would be helpful. And I apologize. I know that you have a lot going on.
Yes, we will do it. Well, if there's nothing else, it looks like we're right at 1. Any last questions, comments? Otherwise, thank you. I'm sorry about my technical difficulties. A lot of good discussion, and thank you to the members of the public who came to speak. I appreciate you guys responding to some of the technical questions from the subcommittee. It's always very helpful for us. And with that, see you next month.